Little Green Men, the Fry Corps, the Condor Legion, all proxies, so-called volunteers fighting your wars for them, so you can say that it has nothing to do with you. Proxy war is as old as war itself, and it's useful for hot war, cold war, and warmish war. It's a useful weapon in every state's arsenal. So what is its history and future? Do join me, Jan Darasz, for how we got here.
Proxy wars have a long history. The use of belligerents by more powerful entities against other foreign actors dates back to the Byzantine Empire, some researchers say. This technique was used by the British and the French in the 100 Years' War. Then it was often about targeting ships of the enemy, the perfect way to make pirates useful. In the 20th century, the most vivid examples of proxy wars concern the Cold War. Hostilities between the US and Soviet proxies fought in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Israel, among others. Often, it wasn't so much about the usefulness of proxies. With nuclear weapons in the hands of both powers, it was safer to use proxies instead of risking an outbreak of a direct, deadly war. But then, were they not deadly? 20 million people died in wars during that time. 99% of casualties died on the battlefields of developing nations. All of them were victims of the broader clash between communism and capitalism. Proxy wars are still being fought today, whether it's Iran's allies from Hamas and Hezbollah or Russia's Wagner Group. The scheme stays the same. Russia has been indirectly involved in several takeovers of power by force in the so-called African coup belt, but it seems that Moscow's main motive here was not to gain new partners, but rather to push back European influence in Africa. A proxy war, by definition.
I'm joined today by Filip Bryjka. He's a political scientist and working at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and also the author of Proxy Wars, Why They Erupt and Who Fights Them. Fascinating topic. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you for the invitation.
Right, proxy wars. Let's start off with a definition. What is it that differentiates a proxy war from, I don't know, the war that we see in Ukraine today, the classical tank on tank battle, big power war? How do you define it in particular?
Unfortunately, there is no only one definition of proxy wars that all of the researchers, scholars, analysts could agree on. But there are two main approaches to defining proxy war as a phenomenon. So firstly, I call this approach a Cold War era approach, which defines proxy war as indirect confrontations between at least two foreign powers waging a war through intermediaries, through proxies, on the soil of third party. And of course, during the Cold War, the phenomenon of proxy wars has developed. We had number of this type of confrontations starting from Korea Peninsula in the 50s, and then Southeast Asia as a region, Middle East, Africa and Latin America. And of course that was a result of the Cold War logic and bipolar geopolitical rivalry between Soviet Union and United States, which this rivalry was perceived as a zero-sum game. So whenever one of the superpowers were engaging and supporting a side of the armed conflict, the second side decided to join and to balance the power and try to at least maintain or not allow the adversary to expand its sphere of influence. But this is a relic of Cold War approach. And after the end of this period of time, the type of conflicts that we observe has changed. So we had a drastic increase of civil wars with very different origins of the conflict and reasons. So we had a marriage of ethnic and territorial disputes. 90% of all armed conflicts were not interstate wars, but civil wars. But most of those civil wars were to some extent internationalized through the engagement of foreign actors, external powers. But it doesn't mean that all of those external engagement can be qualified as a proxy war. So the new approach to defining proxy war, I call it a strategic approach, pays more attention to the proxy war as a sort of indirect form of engagement into a conflict to shape its strategic outcome through delivery of military support, arms supplies, ammunition, logistics hub, military training, intelligence, and other form of support. So it's rather a very rational and pragmatic approach to limit potential risks and costs related to direct confrontations. But this is approach which focus on indirect influencing the conflict.
And it's a very, you seem to suggest that it's a very effective way of projecting foreign policy.
It's effective in offensive way, especially. So the state may employ, for example, state or non-state actor to wage a war on behalf of the sponsor, and usually in these cases those wars are they have offensive nature, so they are aimed, for example, to change a regime, to get some territorial gains, like for during supporting separatist movements, or to destabilize the adversary. And in this understanding, proxy wars are very effective because the costs related to waging such a war are much lesser comparing to the cost on the state who has to deal with such unstable situation. But in the opposite way, if we want to, let's say, protect our ally who is engaged into destabilization orchestrated by the foreign power, it's much more costly for the patron to do so.
The history of proxy war seems to be as old as war itself. We can go back to, I don't know, Polish example, Lisowski Cossacks, 30 Years' War. You go back all the way through to the Byzantine, the ancient Greeks. The deniability of a state to fight, to be directly involved, poses what is the relationship between the state who sponsors these groups and the relationship between the ones who are being told or ordered to fight? Is it a controllable thing for the big state?
Very frequently, waging war by proxy may be a double-edged sword, and there is a number of historical examples of blowback, so unintended consequences.
Such as what? What are these?
I think one of the best examples is U.S. policy to Afghanistan and supporting Mujahedeens, which of course during Soviet invasion it was very rational and pragmatic approach from United States, but the way how this Operation Cyclone was conducted, where Pakistani intelligence played a key role to selecting groups who received this military support, and was one of the elements that United States had no fully control over this process, and Pakistani intelligence had in this process also they have their own agenda, because they were thinking about in a strategic terms, and they were looking for creating Afghanistan as a country which will be governed by the Pashtun groups. So they also trying to express their agenda and their geopolitical goals, and therefore, and because of many other reasons, especially the abandon of Afghanistan after the end of the Cold War. So United States were not really interested about the situation and the investment and controlling this country in any matter, led to uncontrolled another wave of civil war and violence, and the weaponry which was delivered during the 80s then was even used against coalition troops after 9/11.
The idea of keeping these the relationship between the sponsor and the proxy group, everybody knows that for example, Russia is sponsoring or had sponsored Little Green Men in Crimea. America sponsoring the Mujahideen. Does that defeat the object of this relationship, to keep it secret, or does it not matter?
I think nowadays, because of the new technologies, because of the access to information, because of the work of investigative journalists, it's much harder to maintain plausible deniability. The great example is Wagner Group, which for 8 years Kremlin was denying that such group even exists or operates anywhere, but because of the work of investigative journalists, because of the change to approach to revealing some intelligence, public opinion was aware that this group is almost fully controlled by Russia. And I think the ability to deny that state is to some extent involved into covert actions like this has changed, and therefore, for example, United States decided to almost openly carry out paramilitary operation in Syria, revealing that they do so. Of course, it was ineffective, but because of other reasons, because keeping in mind the lessons that they learned from the historical examples, they were looking for, they were training moderate Syrian rebels. So they imposed a lot of mechanisms of control, starting with the selection of recruits who could be trained by United States. So they were only looking for people who were not linked to any terrorist organization, which was, of course, very challenging in case of, war-torn Syria. So that was the first thing.
You're recruiting a certain caliber of people, and you need a certain type of fighter. What's the legal status of this relationship, or does it rely on not having a legal status or having an unclear legal status?
So there is no legal term as proxy wars. It's rather academic and analytical term that we use as some sort of framework that allows us to analyze very complex conflicts with special attention to the role of external actors supporting belligerents, and analyzing the relations between the sponsor and receiver of the supplies. But it's, of course, a huge difference if military assistance is provided to sovereign country or to non-state actor. If we look into international law, there is a United Nations General Assembly resolution from 1974, which defines armed aggression and enlists a number of actions which could be treated as a armed aggression. And the last point is that providing military assistance, financial assistance, training, or sanctuary to irregular formations, rebels, militias, or terrorist organizations may be treated as a aggression. So we have to analyze each case separately. We cannot make too far-reaching simplifications, because there are a number of ethical and moral concerns that we can have deciding whether to provide or not to provide assistance to this particular actor.
It seems like a legal minefield, if that's not an unfortunate metaphor to use. But final question to you. The war that everybody seems to be afraid of is the big one, World War III, USA versus China, great power confrontation. Do you see the same scenario that you outlined at the beginning of our discussion, the Cold War scenario, where these two great powers are just going to fight these proxy wars all over the world, like they did in the 50s, 60s and 70s?
Yeah, I think...
I mean, Russia, for example, as well, is Russia a proxy of China? Is calling Ukraine a proxy of the United States? It's a...
Mm-hmm. I think we are living in a much more complex international conditions comparing to the bipolar Cold War world, which was pretty simple. So every actor was on the other side, except of course the group of countries which were neutral. And now the proxy, waging war by proxy is not only limited to the superpowers, but also much smaller states, but with huge regional ambitions like Turkey, Iran, yep. Saudi Arabia, and many others. It's not only a matter of the Middle East. Also applies this model of projection of force, of foreign policy with the use of force, but without declaring a war across the globe. So I think that this is something that will exist with us and will be developed. And referring to answering your question, whether we can predict some large-scale conflicts. Probably a couple of years ago, I would say no. This is exactly the proxy war model is something that gives the state this ability to avoid direct confrontations, but unjustified, unprovoked, full-scale invasion of Ukraine started by Russia. Unfortunately, raise a huge pessimism in my assessment.
Yeah. Well, I forget which Greek philosopher said it, only the dead will see the end of war. So, but anyway, Filip Bryjka, thank you very much for coming onto the programme. Great to have you.
Thank you.
So that indeed is all we have time for today. Do join us for How We Got Here next time.